The fantasy genre is going through a major transformation. Once dominated by sprawling epics filled with swords, dragons, and brooding male heroes, fantasy is now bursting with emotionally rich, character-driven stories where romance, magic, and female perspectives take center stage. We're living in the age of romantasy, and it's reshaping the publishing industry. But here's the question: why does it feel like fantasy is being marketed almost entirely to women right now? Are men losing interest? Are publishers shifting priorities? Or is something deeper happening in the way we tell and sell stories?
If you walked into a bookstore lately, you've probably seen it already. The fantasy genre section has been dominated by a specific type of books. So the changes are pretty noticeable. If you've been following the fantasy genre for a while, you know we had an overwhelming tendency to cater towards male interests in the male audience. But this doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So either you're loving the shift or not. This video is for you who wants to understand what is causing these changes, how are male versus female reading patterns changing over time, and why, and what does this mean for the future of
fantasy as a genre.
We're going to dive into the rise of romantasy, look at the real data about who's reading and who's buying, explore why men are currently being left out of the marketing conversation, and what that might mean for the future of fantasy. So without further ado, let's get to it.
Let's start with the obvious buzzword, romantasy, the hybrid genre that blends traditional fantasy elements with a central romantic arc. Think Sarah J. Maas, Rebecca Yarros, Jennifer L. Armentrout. Books like A Court of Thorns and Roses or Fourth Wing are dominating, not just in fantasy charts, but in overall book sales. We already explored romantasy in a different video here on the channel. You can find the link to that in the video's description. The point here is to give you a concrete idea of the current state of fantasy publishing. So let's get to the numbers. Between 2020 and 2023, sales of romance and fantasy novels in the US soared by 116% and 163% respectively. This surge in popularity is partly due to the romantasy trend on TikTok, which has significantly boosted interest. As of July 2024, romantasy books comprised 18.3% of the New York Times hardcover fictions bestseller list. Romantasy novels generated more than $610 million in 2024, an increase from a record $454 million in 2023. However, the discourse about men reading less than women may be less supported than we originally thought. According to this Vox article, the idea that men don't read fiction is based on real but modest disparity. A 2017 survey found 50% of women and 33% of men had read a novel or short story in the previous year. UK data from 2017 suggests women bought 63% of fiction, men 37%, a significant but not drastic split. The claim that men don't read fiction has become a cultural myth repeated in essays and op-eds, often without data. The panic reflects broader cultural anxieties, the decline of traditional masculinity, the rise of toxic online figures, and political polarization. Cultural factors may also influence this perception. Fiction has historically been considered a feminine pursuit dating back to Victorian-era values. Influencers like Andrew Tate reinforce this view, calling reading a waste of time. This mindset discourages men from engaging with fiction, reinforcing the gender gap.
So what we can see with these numbers is while romantasy is undeniably reshaping the fantasy publishing landscape, driven by viral trends, a strong female readership, and impressive sales figures, the narrative that men are abandoning fiction altogether is far more nuanced. Yes, women read fiction at higher rates, but the gap is often exaggerated and lacks solid data backing. Cultural narratives as well as gender expectations, they play a really big role in shaping reading habits, with fiction is still often viewed as a feminine space and non-fiction as more acceptable for men. So rather than focusing solely on the numbers, the more meaningful conversation lies in unpacking what fiction means culturally and how gender perceptions around reading are shaped by both tradition and the rise of polarizing online voices about this topic. So I think the natural next question is If men are reading less fiction and fantasy now, what are they doing with their free time? And for those who still enjoy the genre, how are they consuming it? So let's find out.
If most readers are women, and those women are engaging heavily on platforms like TikTok and Instagram to promote the books they love, then of course publishers are going to lean into that energy. That means marketing strategies, book covers, blurbs, and even tropes are being tailored to the most active demographic. Meanwhile, men's engagement with fiction, especially in print form, has declined steadily. Many turn to video games, streaming series, or non-fiction instead. That's not to say men don't read, but they're often not the core audience driving sales, especially in commercial fantasy. Modern media, like video games and streaming services, offer immediate engagement, visual stimulation, and in many cases, interactive storytelling, appealing particularly to younger male audiences. Unlike books which require patience and imagination, games and shows deliver a faster dopamine hit. According to a 2022 Pew Research study, 97% of teen boys in the US play video games compared to 83% of teen girls. The average male gamer spends around 8.5 hours per week gaming, which is often time that might otherwise be spent reading. Fiction, especially emotional or romantic narratives, is still perceived as feminine in many circles. There's a cultural pressure, reinforced by online influencers, that reading fiction isn't manly or productive. Influencers like Andrew Tate have publicly claimed reading fiction is a waste of time, reinforcing toxic masculinity ideals that discourage introspection and vulnerability, core traits often explored in novels. A 2019 UK YouGov survey found that 40% of men reported feeling that fiction wasn't relevant to their lives, versus only 26% of women. Many men who do read tend to prefer nonfiction that promises practical skills, self-improvement, or status knowledge, often framed as more productive. According to a 2020 Statista report, 55% of nonfiction readers were men, compared to 45% women. Popular male nonfiction categories include biographies, politics, history, tech, and business. Genres often marketed with a utilitarian slant. Men, like women, face time constraints, but how they choose to spend limited leisure time differs. According to the American Time Use Survey 2021, men spend only 12 minutes per day on average reading for pleasure, while women spend 19 minutes. Instead, men spend more time on screen-based entertainment, watching sports, browsing YouTube, or gaming. Much of today's commercial fantasy, especially in romantasy and book talk-dominated titles, is marketed with female leads, romantic arcs, and aesthetic branding that doesn't always appeal to male readers. Book covers, blurbs, and marketing campaigns are increasingly designed to appeal to women, and especially young women, which may alienate male readers who feel underrepresented in today's mainstream fiction offerings.
So in summary, men's shift away from fiction and towards other media is driven by a mix of cultural expectations, content preference, marketing focus, and technological distraction, actually. While men still read, particularly nonfiction, the cultural perception of fiction as less masculine or less useful, combined with an immersive pull of modern digital media, has contributed to a noticeable drop in male engagement with commercial fiction.
This shift in readership and cultural momentum is fundamentally reshaping the fantasy publishing landscape. Not just what gets published, but how it's packaged, marketed, and sold. Traditional fantasy once thrived on grimdark anti-heroes, war epics, and hard magic systems filled with deep lore. Instead, editors and agents are paying attention. In acquisition meetings, buzzwords like romantasy, emotionally vulnerable hero, found family, and spice level are now part of the regular pitch vocabulary. Some editors have even stated publicly that they're primarily hunting for titles that can resonate with Book Talk's overwhelmingly female young adult demographic. This doesn't mean plot and world building are unimportant, it just means they now often take a back seat to character dynamics and emotional journeys. Meanwhile, male authors who focus more on action, strategy, and classic quest arcs are finding it harder to break out unless they already have an established following.
So this has led to a narrowing of what types of fantasy make it to the spotlight. Many traditional or guy fantasy books those rooted in action, politics, or gritty realism, are getting less shelf space in media buzz. Titles like The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter or The Poppy War by R.F. Kwan, they show that there's still room for hard-hitting, combat-oriented fantasy. But these are now the exceptions rather than the rule, and even then, they often balance action with heavy emotional or thematic layers. So the result is a self-reinforcing cycle. Fewer greedy action-first books are published, meaning fewer are discovered by readers, which in turn justify the continued pivot towards romantasy and emotional fantasy. It's not that male readers don't exist, it's that the market is increasingly not built for them. And this doesn't just affect the readers, they also shape the types of stories the authors want to tell. Even established male authors, they are beginning to weave more romance or trauma arcs in their fantasy, whether to stay competitive or simply to get through the door. While this shift is exciting and empowering for many readers and writers, especially those long underserved by the genre, it does raise a compelling question. What happens to the rest of fantasy when so much of the market is designed for a specific audience? Yeah, but with all this laid out, the question is this good or bad? Before we discuss that, make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Every resource on the channel here is completely free, including our Discord server, Loregeist Tavern. You can find a link to that in the video description. So the best way to support us is by just helping us to appease the algorithm gods. So make sure to do that. And now let's move on with the video.
Now here's the nuance. This shift isn't necessarily bad. Art and culture work as a pendulum sometimes. For decades, fantasy was a boys' club, centered on male heroes, male readers, and male fantasies. Women authors were often relegated to niche subgenre, or had to publish under male pseudonyms to be taken seriously. Emotion, romance, and vulnerability were seen as distractions from serious storytelling. So the current boom in romantasy and emotionally rich narratives represent a natural swing in the other direction without fully eliminating what fantasy was before. It's broadening the genre and welcoming new readers. Fantasy is evolving, and that evolution is creating space for new voices and perspectives. That also implies that maybe in the future, the market would also be saturated with romantasy and the pendulum would swing back to the other direction. Nothing is hardly permanent when it comes to art. And again, evolution doesn't mean extinction. The rise of one form of fantasy doesn't have to come at the expense of another. The question many are now asking is there still space for traditional epic fantasy or for action-oriented, male-centered stories? And the answer is absolutely. But the landscape has changed. These stories now need to compete in a market where character arcs, emotional stakes, and social visibility matter just as much as swordplay and world building. That doesn't mean stripping away action or grit, it means integrating them into narratives that can connect with modern readers. It means understanding what today's audience craves.
To survive and thrive, these stories need to adapt. That might mean building an online presence and cultivating communities on Reddit, YouTube, or Discord. It could even involve cross-media storytelling like video games, animations, audiobooks that captures readers who might not reach for a 700-page hardcover. And maybe as well, it involves redefining what masculine fantasy looks like. Because masculinity doesn't mean emotional repression, lone wolf brooding, or stoic violence. There is room in fantasy for male protagonists who feel grief, who nurture others, who questions their role in the world, and come out stronger for it. In fact, this is where traditional male fantasy could grow in a meaningful way. Young boys today are bombarded with conflicting messages about what it means to be a man. Too often the loudest voices are cartoonish influencers, selling a hyper-masculine ideal that equates emotion with weakness and fiction with irrelevance. But fiction is exactly where a young man can explore identity, vulnerability, loyalty, failure, and growth. Books that follow male characters through moral dilemmas, emotional reckonings, and internal evolution can model a more mature, well-rounded, reflective masculinity. And we need more of that. We need stories that show boys it's okay to feel, to doubt, to change. That kind of storytelling doesn't weaken men. It helps build stronger, fully realized human beings.
In summary, the fantasy genre is undergoing a major transformation, driven by a surge in romantasy and a powerful wave of female readership that's reshaping what gets published and promoted. While some might see this shift as a loss for traditional, male-centric epic fantasy, the truth is more nuanced. The rise of emotionally rich, character-driven stories is expanding the genre, not replacing it. Readers are responding to stories that center connection, introspection, and personal growth. The dominance of romantasy also opens the door for new voices and storytelling styles that were previously overlooked or undervalued. At the same time, there's still space and a real need for traditional fantasy and male-oriented stories to evolve and reassert themselves in ways that are relevant to modern audiences. Instead of resisting change, this moment offers an opportunity to redefine what masculine storytelling can look like: complex, emotional, and introspective. Fantasy has always thrived on reinvention, and this current shift is just another chapter in its long, ever-evolving saga. Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.